I want you to imagine a hat. Seriously, take a few moments, pause the video, and imagine a hat. When you've done it, unpause the video and we'll continue. Now that you've imagined a hat, I want you to describe that hat to me. What kind of detail did it have? I'm going to guess that for many of you, you probably didn't imagine a Panama hat or a very elaborate hat worn by a woman in the 18th century. You probably imagined something that was really standard for your own use or culture, perhaps a baseball cap. I don't know the answer though. All audiences are different. But if I only say a hat, and I ask you to imagine that, the possibilities that you're imagining do not totally encompass all of the possibilities that something described as a hat might. Instead, what we get is a very blurry, dimmed down, average sense of hat. We get hat in its most basic functional sense, something that one puts on one's head. So we have to realize that in speech, even when we think about speech as referring to something, it's doing more than that, and also less. When I told you to imagine a hat, was I referring to any specific hat in the world? Not really. I'm just referring to the idea of a hat. But the image that you would have of a hat, were I to refer to it in some real context, would probably only be as vivid as the speaker, me, would ask you for it to be. You could think of this metaphorically as almost like a chemical property of language. Just like atoms and the electron shells that surround them are always looking for the lowest energy valence that they can be in, audiences are always going to find the least vivid version of what you're asking them to imagine. So in order to make something higher energy, we actually have to create an artificial situation that is going to bring about the detail that might be necessary or desirable for our speech. But why is vividness important anyway? Why is it important for things to be vivid? Well, there's a number of reasons. The first reason is study after study shows that vividness allows memory to last longer. Certain studies have been done on jurors, mock jurors in trials, being given evidence with irrelevant details in it. Witnesses who give those irrelevant, vivid details tend to be more persuasive. Now, it seems maybe obvious why this is the case. You tend to believe someone more as a witness of something if they're able to tell you in specific detail what they saw. Perhaps that doesn't generalize to any situation. Not in every situation would someone be like a witness who's trying to give specific detail and try to prove that what they saw was accurate and factual. But some of these studies also show another interesting effect. First, this persuasiveness doesn't appear immediately after someone speaks. It appears days later, that someone who has spoken with greater detail or more even irrelevant detail, days later, they are judged to be more persuasive in these studies. And so there what we see is the way that memory relates to the persuasive character of a speech. I am actually able to remember more of the information that was given in someone's testimony, and that's part of its persuasiveness. I'm able to recall more of the detail because there's more detail in the narrative itself. There's more hooks, so to speak, to hang the facts on. But vividness doesn't just activate memory, it creates memory. Vividness invokes past sensory memories in the audience and allows us to recombine them imaginatively to create something new. Although vividness requires more than mere description, To see what it does require, it may be helpful to begin with an image and see what happens when we try to translate it into speech. I find helpful for this the theorist Roland Barthes' theory of photography, which is written in his book Camera Lucida. He distinguished between the studium and the punctum of a photograph. So first we're going to think about studium. Barthes talks about this exact photograph to theorize what studium means. He says, I was glancing through an illustrated magazine. A photograph made me pause. Nothing very extraordinary. The photographic banality of a rebellion in Nicaragua. A ruined street, 2 helmeted soldiers on patrol. Behind them, 2 nuns. Did this photograph please me, interest me, intrigue me? Not even. Simply, it existed for me. I understood at once that its existence, its adventure, derived from the co-presence of 2 discontinuous elements, heterogeneous in that they did not belong to the same world. No need to proceed to the point of contrast. Of course, he means the soldiers and the nuns. We can see here photographically something that we already referred to when we were thinking about style in language, which is counterpoint, contrapposto, the discontinuous relationship between 2 different elements, antithesis. This produces interest, and in that it can exist for an audience. If it is a mere documentation of just someone's view of something, its relationship to their concern is not immediately apparent. And so that stylistic dimension is what allows the photograph to, quote, exist, unquote, for an audience, according to Barthes. And this interest is what he is calling its studium. If the studium is what is interesting in a photograph, what is the punctum? Barthes says, very often the punctum is a detail, that is, a partial object. Hence, to give examples of punctum is, in a certain fashion, to give myself up. Here is a family of American blacks, photographed in 1926 by James Van Der Zee. The studium is clear. I am sympathetically interested, as a docile cultural subject, in what the photograph has to say, for it speaks. It is a good photograph. It utters respectability, family life, conformism, Sunday best, an effort of social advancement in order to assume the white man's attributes, an effort touching by reason of its naivete. The spectacle interests me but does not prick me. What does, strange to say, is the belt worn low by the sister or daughter, whose arms are crossed behind her back like a schoolgirl, and above all, her strapped pumps. Mary Jane's. Why does this dated fashion touch me? I mean, to what date does it refer me? This particular punctum arouses great sympathy in me, almost a kind of tenderness. If we zoom in here and see the detail that he's talking about, it's something that hardly is what the picture is about. It's something that is not, so to speak, what the picture has to say for itself. It's a very small detail that says something else without being clear in what it's saying. For Barthes, the puncta of photographs are what give it emotional resonance. They're not always what the photograph is about. In fact, almost structurally, they cannot be. So when we look at the photograph from Nicaragua and we see that it is about rebellion, we are enclosed within the genres of news photography and the iconicity that it generically portrays of unrest. The interest comes from that slight discontinuity between what is captured in the photograph, the nuns versus the soldiers. But here, the potential discontinuities in the photograph of James Van Der Zee, the famous Harlem photographer, those are not necessarily what give it emotional resonance. What might give it emotional resonance could be vary greatly between different audiences. And they may be small details, like the shoes or the belt worn low. Equipped with this vocabulary, I now want to ask you to do your best to try to describe a series of photographs. I'll start with one that I've chosen myself, and this is Mary Ellen Mark's photography, a famous photographer who recently passed. What's the studium here? Well, there clearly is some kind of discontinuity between the cool, disaffected look of the young woman smoking on the park bench, probably Central Park in New York, and the childish gesture of holding and close to your body a stuffed horse. That, for me, is what makes the photograph interesting, ultimately. There are other details that make the photograph beautiful. The way that the light reflects on her hair or on the greenery in the background. But for me, the punctum is actually a small detail about the horse. It's wearing a bridle, one that looks like she made herself out of a shoelace or a small piece of rope. I can't say quite what that means, but it does affect me in some way. I'd like you to take a turn at trying to render these photographs into a vivid but short description. I want you to take each in 3 steps. In the first step, take a piece of paper and try to describe simply as much of the photograph as you can. Try to give it as exhaustive a description as possible. Perhaps you're going to talk about all the elements of the background, the colors, the details of clothing, all of these details, as many as you can put down. In the next step, I want you to try to identify the studium, if possible. Is there anything that this photograph is saying? And which of the details that you've already outlined best set that out? Where is there a clear contrast? In the final step, I want you to just pause and see if you are affected by the image. What detail is most affecting to you? Taking all of that, then render your description, selecting the details that you think are necessary for the audience to simply get an image of what is happening, then setting those against the details that are the studium, that give us that moment of contrast that allows us to see what the photograph says, and then ending by pulling us in to a moment that is most affecting to you. You have to take care with your language in doing this, because if how you're saying it is all that the audience has, what they are imagining is going to depend upon your choice of words and your framing of the sentences. So the first one here is Philip Lorca di Corsia's Madras from 1988. Take a few minutes. With this photograph, you can pause the video before moving on to the next. This is Diane Arbus's Xmas tree in a Levittown living room. Saturday morning at the hypermarket, the Miss Lovely Legs competition in Boksburg, South Africa from 1980. I'd love to hear or read your descriptions of these photographs that you've seen or others that you find particularly moving or touching. So feel free to leave them in a comment below the video or put them in the Discord. But how do we take this new skill of thinking about how to identify the studium or the punctum in the photograph and relate that to vividness in a speech? Well, one of the key takeaways I think here is that we don't want to simply create vividness by trying to exhaustively detail whatever we're describing. One of the speeches of a student that I most remember in a different assignment, and I asked them to combine 2 different sensory details to give me the sense of a place. And I'll never forget her combination. the smell of acrylics and cut onions. This was a sandwich shop that was next to a nail salon or a paint shop. Actually, I'm not sure which one. But regardless of that, that incredible combination of smells is not one that I've ever experienced. But the vividness of trying to imagine that actually gave me that memory that I was almost implanted in me in an Inception-like manner. I now feel like I visited a sandwich shop next to a nail salon because I know what the smell of onions and acrylics might feel like.